Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Beginner Breakdown. My name as always is Alex Moellering, and it's been a while. I apologize for missing out on you so long. We've had a combination of tournaments and technical difficulties, but we are back. And tonight we're going to talk about some exciting news, how to get a promotion, right? You're at work, you're really trying to climb the corporate ladder, and this is a chess video, so we're actually going to be talking about pawn promotions here. Which is still exciting, right? Important news. And I did a stream not too long ago on some of the basic checkmates, right? So if you're at the end of the game and you have a rook and a queen, you can do a ladder checkmate, or just a queen and just a rook. We can look at some of those as well if we have time. But I think it's important to start with the end in mind in chess. And a lot of games, right, you have to know a little bit of openings, at least the opening principles, because that's how every game starts, right? Every game of chess you play is going to involve the opening principles. And then a lot of the games you play, if you don't fall for some opening trap and get checkmated really quickly, are going to devolve into some kind of middle game, where you and your opponent are trying to play for tactical wins, strategical ideas, targeting weaknesses, and that's really important too. But then there's also a handful of chess games, I'd say a decent amount, especially as you get slightly stronger, that go all the way to endgames. Most of the pieces have been traded off, and it's about pressing very small advantages. Now there's a lot of minutia and important ideas in the endgame, but one of the most fundamental, if not the most, perhaps save the basic checkmates, is how to promote a pawn. Because the way you win a lot of games when it's very close, when there's not a lot of material left, is one side maybe has a couple extra pawns than the other, and the goal is to try and force one of them to win. Now, if there's multiple pawns on the board, I actually have a plan to do a lecture in the coming weeks that addresses if it's slightly more complex, multiple pawns, maybe a piece, and what to do in those types of situations. But tonight we're going to start with just one, right? If one side has one pawn, can they promote it or not, and how do we figure that out? Because if you know how to promote a pawn, and you know how to checkmate with a queen, then you can win if you get an extra pawn in an endgame. So that's kind of my theory here with working backwards. And the first place I want to start is with what I call a known position. Some people, I think the more technical term is a theoretical endgame. And the way we would differentiate it is if I look at this position, I would say in my mind, this is something I just know. I don't have to calculate anything. I don't have to look at the board and think about it, think about variations. I just know, looking at this exact position, who will win and who will lose. And I know why. In this case, it'd be better to say I know whether or not white will win, because it's impossible for black to win without a pawn. It's insufficient mating material. So the best black can hope for is a draw. But looking at this position, I can tell you without any thought who is going to win or if it's going to be a draw. And I keep saying who's going to win. In this case, white is going to win this game. Now in this position, it does not matter whose turn it is to move. So it could be black to move, it could be white to move. It doesn't matter whether my king is on this square or on this square or on this square. As long as my king is on one of the three squares in front of the pawn, and it's in this specific orientation, I know white's going to win. So here's what I'm looking for, right? Because this is what we're going to keep working backwards from. The very backwards working is when we actually promote to a queen or something like that, and then we get a checkmate. But we're going to go one step before that. In this case, what I am looking for is my king to be on the 6th rank, my pawn to be on the 5th rank. That's all I'm looking for. If I was playing as black, it would be the 3rd and the 4th. But basically, my king is 2 moves away from the end of the board, and the pawn is 1 move behind it. And the king is directly defending the pawn from the front, right? So it could be on the right or the left or in the center here, but it's somewhere in front of the pawn, 1 rank up. If all of those things are true, it again does not matter whose turn it is to move. All that matters is who has opposition. So we're going to come back to this position in a moment. But first we need to talk about opposition, because it's a really basic idea. Very simply, opposition is where the 2 kings are in a straight line facing each other. That's all it is. And there's different kinds. So if it's white to move here, and I played the move king to d4, our kings would be in direct opposition. There is exactly one square in between, and we're in a straight line facing each other. You could have indirect opposition as well, which would be if my king went here to like a diagonal, right? There's one square in between, we're in a straight line. And indirect opposition will usually transpose into direct opposition. So if black here, we can look at any move they can play. If they go straight backwards, I can keep in direct opposition, and then something will, again, reflect from there. If they go, say, forwards, I can come this way and take opposition here. If they go to e6 here, I can, again, take opposition directly right here. If they went backwards, I could do the same. So the person who takes opposition is, of all things being equal, the person who takes opposition is able to maintain it. And this is really important, because this is what determines who's going to win and lose a lot of king and pawn endgames. So we'll come back to why that's important in the general endgame in a moment. But I want to return to this theoretical position. So because I said here, it doesn't matter whose turn it is. All that matters is who has opposition. And in this case, let's say it is white's turn to move. If it's white's turn to move, the reason we can win this game is because we can take opposition, force our opponent's king to move. And this is maybe the critical part. The reason why opposition is so important in these endgames is because in any endgame, the primary objective is controlling space. Now you might say, well, isn't the main point to get a checkmate? Well, it is, but how do you get checkmate? You control the space your opponent's king needs to go. So in this case, by putting my king in opposition directly in front in a line, then the only way my opponent can move is sideways or backwards. In this case, my opponent is already at the edge of the board, so they can just move sideways. If they were farther up, backwards. But critically, my opponent cannot move forwards. They cannot make any forward progress. So we are controlling the space of progression. This is why opposition important. Is breaking opposition strategically called shouldering? I'm not sure if you heard that term. It would make sense. We'll talk about keeping opposition and kind of transitioning and using it. The term I'm going to use is outflanking, but we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so first here with opposition. So the problem black has is they have to concede space. They're going to go left or right, and either way they go, I am now going to do what I call making the red carpet. So the way you win in a king and pawn endgame, where one side just has one pawn, right, where you have one pawn, is, if you remember nothing else from this lecture, remember this. You want your king in front of your pawn. If your king is behind the pawn or equal to it, your opponent often has chances to force a draw. But if your king is far enough ahead of the pawn, you can usually force a win. Again, we'll get to the specifics in a moment. But with my king in front of the pawn, what I am doing is I am laying out the red carpet. I am controlling the spaces in front of the pawn where it can move forwards. So this pawn now, in this case, I actually control every square my pawn needs to move in order to be promoted. So no matter what moves black plays here, there's actually nothing to stop me from playing pawn e6, e7, e8, queen or rook or whatever. So this is really critical. I've laid out the red carpet and the pawn is ready to move forward and become the queen that she was always meant to be. If in this position, because I said all that matters is opposition, but I also said we're winning no matter what. Let's pretend black has opposition here. So I'm going to kind of just play a few moves to triangulate my king in order to force it. So now my opponent has opposition, right? Black has just moved to d8 and taken opposition. When this is the case, if I am on the 6th rank and my pawn is on the 5th, right? That's the first thing I need to create. Then it doesn't matter that they have opposition. The timing is still going to work out just right. And what you're looking for, another way to determine if you're going to be able to force a win when you try and promote one pawn, is you want the pawn to reach the penultimate rank. So that's going to be the 7th or the 2nd, depending on what color you're playing as. You want it to get to the second to last square, and you want it not to call check. Here's what I mean. If the pawn pushes forward here, black has a choice. They can either step out of the way or in the way, If they go too far, then when I push the pawn, I actually just control all the squares, so they can't come back and stop me. So really, black here has to step in front of my pawn. And now notice, when I push it to the penultimate rank, it is pushed without calling check. What that means is because my opponent's king is already in front of the pawn, he has to step out of the way. In this case, the only way to do that is to step to the side here. And like before, I can move my king to create the red carpet here, and promotion is once again inevitable. What happens if I try and do that in the initial position, where I am the one who has opposition, right? In this case, the move I need to play to win this game is king to e6, taking opposition so I can make forward progress and make the red carpet. But if I try and push the pawn right now, it's actually now a draw. Because black, what black needs to do is step in front of me and take opposition. If you step out of the way, then once again you allow me to step forward. So you can't let me control the promotion square. So you take opposition, right? Keep my king from moving forwards. And now, notice, whenever I push the pawn, it's check. And because it's check, the king is not in front of the pawn, the king is allowed to step in front. If you go the other way, I just promote, so that's silly. So the king steps in front of the pawn. And now white is in Zugzwang, which is a German word. Essentially, it means everything I do is worse for me, right? I'm only hurting myself. The best move in this position, if it were possible, would be to pass the turn. Because if we look here at all the squares my king can go to, the only one that defends the pawn is e6, right? If I step anywhere else, opponent's king takes the pawn, it's just king versus king, this is a draw. So if I go to e6 to defend the pawn, the game is over and it's a draw. This is called a stalemate, which is essentially the king, your opponent, has no legal moves, but it's not check. My pawn controls these two squares, my king controls these three. Black has nowhere to safely put the king, but their king is not currently in danger, so it's not a checkmate, it's a stalemate, and the game is a draw. So the two things we want to focus on here, right? Our goal in a king and pawn endgame is to achieve this position, right? It doesn't matter whose turn it is, it doesn't matter if the king is on f6, e6, d6, right? Just somewhere in front of our pawn on the 6th rank with the pawn 1 row below. And again, if you're playing black, it's 3 and 4. And then you ask yourself, do I have opposition or does my opponent? If I have opposition, I need to take it. Because if you just push the pawn, you will push it with check and it's going to be a draw. So if I have opposition, I take it. My opponent has to move. And when they do, I step forward, control the promotion squares, make the red carpet. If I do not have opposition, if I do not have opposition, then what I need to do is just get out of the way of the pawn. So we can imagine if it's opposition, something like this, right? Where the kings are doesn't matter. I just step my king out of the way, and the timing works out so that I can push the pawn without calling check, and my king steps forward and promotes. Once I have the queen, I can go on to get a checkmate. So this is our first known position, or theoretical endgame. The contrast would be like a practical endgame, which is where we can look at it and take educated guesses or have principles for how we should play, but we're still going to have to calculate. We don't know just by looking at it unless you're like a computer or a really good player. But generally, anyone can look at this position, right? If I know those rules, my king is on the 6th, my pawn is on the 5th, I know I'm going to win. Okay, so this is what we're shooting for. We want our king in front of the pawn, and we want to reach a position like this. So how do we actually do it, right? We can imagine our pawn is back at the start, and again, the kings are on their starting squares, so maybe this is not like the perfect setup for something that would actually naturally happen in a game. But the good news is we're very quickly going to understand the principles that allow us to know whether or not white is going to win or lose here. Because once again, this is a theoretical endgame. This is a known position, and I can tell you just by looking at it that white wins. But the reason is slightly different, because now what I'm looking for are the key squares. So in this case, what I know is that if white can get their king to one of the key squares, there are 3 of them, I'll show them in a moment. If we can get to a key square, we can win the game by force. Where are the key squares? They're the 3 squares. Think back to when we were on the 6th and 5th, right? It's the 3 squares immediately in front of the pawn, but we need one more forward, and we'll show that in a moment. So in this case, while the pawn is on e2, the key squares are d4, e4, and f4, right? The 3 right in front of the pawn, but 1 extra row up. And again, we'll talk about why we need that extra space in a moment. So basically, we just need to get our king in front. And all I have to do in this position is calculate, can I get my king to one of those squares, or can my opponent stop me? Well, let's imagine it's white to move here. I will play king d2. Let's say opponent just goes forward. King e3, opponent goes forward. I have my pick and go to any of these squares. So if it's white to move here, white is able to force a win. Let's say it's black to move here. Okay, black goes, let's say, to e7. I step forward. Black goes to, let's say, e6. I step forward again. And black goes to e5. Interesting. So because I put it as white to move, I'm actually going to just step to the side as the first move, and that's going to then force what would have happened here. Notice that I now have lost opposition because I took my time here. I didn't just go right away. I can't get to a key square. And here's what's critical. The reason I cannot get to one of these key squares, no matter what I do, is because black has opposition. Remember, when one of the kings takes opposition, what you're doing is you're controlling the space in front of the opponent's king. So I can make plenty of king moves, but none of them go forwards. And it gets worse. Because if I step backwards, then you can just follow me and keep me behind the pawn. We already know I'm losing progress there. If I step to the side, then my opponent can literally just copy me and maintain opposition. And I still have no way to move forwards. And I can dance around forever, but I'm never going to get to step forward if my opponent doesn't let me. And if I step behind the pawn, then I'm in trouble. This is now going to, now my opponent can force what we saw when we were in that known position, but messed up, right? That when we took opposition, or when we needed to take opposition and didn't, what happened was I ended up having to push the pawn forward to the 7th rank. It reached with check, and my opponent was able to slide their king in front of the pawn. So we can see that happen here, right? Let's just say my opponent, basically in this position, once the king can't get to a key square, once I'm behind the pawn or next to it, all black wants to do is keep their king directly in front of this pawn or take opposition. If they do one of those 2 things, then they can't lose. So let's watch. Okay, I can't move my king forward, so I'm just going to push the pawn. Black stays in front of the pawn. I move my king forward. Black can't stay in front of the pawn here, so it takes opposition. All right, I can move backwards, but again, you just go back in front of the pawn. So eventually I will have to push it. And eventually, as we work our way down the board, we reach a position like this, where my opponent has successfully kept me from making forward progress. And here, right, the rest of it is not so important as long as black keeps my king from getting in front of the pawn. Here, black has 3 legal moves, and only one of them is good. Black has to stay directly in front of the pawn. Why is that? Because if black moves to the side, f8 or d8 here, then I can approach with opposition. I regain it, they've given it up, and now notice, when they step out of the way, I push the pawn without calling check. So black instead has to step straight back, and wherever I go, instead of me taking opposition, black gets to meet me. Once they've done that, I can keep running around, but as long as black follows this rule and just goes straight back to prepare to meet me with opposition, eventually I will run out of moves. It'll be a 3-fold repetition or a 50-move rule, and I will have to push the pawn. Black will step in front, and I will either let them capture it or force a stalemate. So that's what we're shooting to not happen, right? We don't want, I mean, if you're playing as the defending player here, it's important to know, right? Because sometimes you're in a losing pawn endgame, But we can still force draws if we're really careful and pay attention to who has opposition, who can get to the key squares. We're going to look at a few more examples of that, but now let's quickly look at what happens if we do this right. So we're going to move our king forwards onto any of the key squares. It doesn't matter which. But I'm going to go straight forward and take opposition, right? If I can take opposition, I don't have a good reason not to. Black has options. They can step backwards or they can go sideways, but because I have opposition, they can't go forwards. The natural moves are just to try and move to the side, right? Because if they go backwards, at very worst, I can take opposition and follow them, and I'm continuing to keep forward progress. Notice it's not really ever a danger for me to get too far in front of my pawn. The only way that gets bad is if I'm getting too far ahead and my opponent's like sneaking up already from the side. But as long as I'm in between my opponent's king and my pawn, they have to get through me to get to it, so I'm not worried about that. So I can just keep following them back as far as they'll let me, and once I get my king to the 6th, remember, all I have to do is push the pawn, and opposition doesn't matter anymore, right? I know if I have it here, in this case I do, I could choose to take it, I know that I could win. Now this would also work, but I'm already where I need to be in order to outflank and control the red carpet. So that's kind of if they take it easy on us. But if black plays smart and tries to give as little space as possible, then it's white to move, and I actually have to be really careful here. There's only one move that makes progress. So I know I've kind of been just lecturing at you, but if you are in the chat here or in person and want to suggest what you think white should do in this position, please give your suggestion, and I'll kind of talk through some of those answers. So if you're watching this later on YouTube, you're always free to pause the video at any time to try and think through the position yourself before I explain it. So any idea what white should do here to make progress? And feel free to take a guess if you're not sure. Wrong answers are sometimes as instructive as good ones. Okay, we have king f4 suggested in the chat. King f4 I think is a very safe move. One of the things you can always remember is if we're on a key square, then we can't lose. The only time it's a draw if we have our king on a key square, the only time is literally if our opponent is actively attacking our pawn. Because then if we're on a key square, we're too far away to defend it and they take it. Any other situation, if we are on a key square, we can't lose. So king f4, we know at the very least, we're able to hold a win. King f5 also suggested. Now we're moving off a key square, but this is actually the best move. What's the reason? Well, because remember the goal of this endgame. Like I said earlier, we need to keep our king in front of the pawn, and we want to form the red carpet. So right now, I control this square in front of the pawn. Once I go here, I control these squares. And the farther down the board I get, the better a chance I have of forcing promotion. Now, once I've done this, this is what we would call outflanking. Outflanking does something really interesting because it actually gives up opposition. But the thing about opposition is you have to remember it's a means to an end. The reason we take opposition is because we want to control space. In this case, our opponent can take indirect opposition here or direct opposition here. If they take indirect opposition, well, they're still conceding space and I can just kind of follow them forward. Maybe I shouldn't, maybe I should have pushed the pawn first, but at the very least, I'm not in trouble by doing that. I might just not be making progress. If they take direct opposition, well, the question we need to ask is, can we get to a key square? In this case, at the very least, we can always step back, so we know we can force a win. And here, some people would be tempted to keep moving too far forward, but remember as well, we need to keep our king in between our opponent's king and this pawn. If we let this king get too close, we're going to lose. So here, I would say let's find a safe square to push the pawn. And all you have to do is figure out, once the pawn is pushed, am I able to get to a key square? So this is kind of the other thing to think about. In this type of endgame, before you ever push the pawn, you always want to think, can I forcibly get my king onto one of the key squares from where the pawn will be? So let's do some thought real quick. In this position, the key squares are these three. So if I have no other move, I can always step onto a key square, and I'm doing okay. But I can also move the pawn. I can move it to e3, or because it's on the second rank and hasn't moved, I can move it to e4. And we can think whether one or both of those moves are safe. If I move it to e3, where are the key squares for this pawn? It's the 3 immediately in front and then up a row. So it's d5, e5, f5. In this case, my king is already on one of those squares, so I know I'm good. So e3 is a safe move to play here. What about e4? Well, if I push the pawn to e4, the key squares will be d6, e6, and f6. And the question I need to ask is, can black play any move that keeps me from going to any one of those squares, right? If they cut off 2 of those squares but not the third, that's not good enough. They have to stop me from going to all 3. And the answer is no. There's no move that black can play to stop me from going to f6. They can play king to d6, and that stops me from getting to these 2 squares, but they cannot stop me from going to f6. So e4 is also safe. Again, if you don't have a lot of time and you're in an endgame and you're not sure to calculate it, then you can always play the safe move. There's no harm in that. But the principle here still shows that this move is safe. We have defended the pawn. Black is going to have to step out of the way, and we can get onto a key square. So we know we're still doing okay. Let's come back to the start. We're going to get our king in front of the pawn, and I'm actually going to play a weird move here. I'm going to play king to d4, because this is also going to be instructive. Black is now able to take opposition. And remember, I said we don't want to let our opponent take opposition, but we're on a key square. So we know we're going to win. Let's figure out why. Black has succeeded in taking opposition. I cannot move my king forward in any meaningful way. If I go to the side, they will follow and continue. But I have a way to get out of this trap. Because I am not on a square immediately in front of the pawn, but there is that one gap row in between, I can take back opposition, not by moving my king, but by pushing the pawn. Now, notice what happens here. I've pushed the pawn, and it's now black to move. So I have taken opposition. You have to concede space. And whichever side you move to, I can move forward in the other direction and get back onto that key square. If you weren't sure, right, if you weren't sure about pushing the pawn, you can always double check that in your head and say, well, wait a minute. If the pawn's going to go to e3, then the key squares will be these 3, d5, e5, f5. Can I force my king onto one of those? And we can think about it and say, well, I push my pawn to e3. Black has to play a move. The only square their king can be to stop me from going to any of those 3 is the square it's on right now. It has to step away from that square, and so I will be able to get onto one of those. And once again, I'm outflanking, right? I'm allowing black to take opposition if they want it, but that doesn't matter because I've gotten to the key square and I'm able to keep making progress towards the end of the board. So this is the reason why the key squares are not right in front of the pawn. It's why they are this one extra row ahead. Because sometimes if your opponent takes opposition, you need to be able to break the space with this breathing move. Otherwise, right, say, again, let's say I push, opponent goes here, I step this way. Opponent goes here. I take opposition. My opponent steps to the side. In this case, I need to outflank. But if I don't, if I push the pawn, let's think about where the key squares are. Once the pawn is on e4, the key squares are d6, e6, f6. Can my opponent play any move to stop me from getting to all 3 of those squares? Yes. Black can take opposition here. And because I can't push the pawn, I can't waste a move, and it's now a draw. The reason, and the last thing I'll cover before we kind of talk about everything in the theoretical ideas, and then we'll get to some more kind of noodly things. But really, if you understand these fundamentals, you're going to win every king and pawn endgame that is winnable with just king and 1 pawn. Again, it gets more complex as we add things. The reason it doesn't matter to have that extra space on the 6th and 5th is really interesting. Let's take a look at that here. So let's say I outflank, and I'm just going to push the pawn. Okay, in this case, I pushed the pawn, and I can just make the promotion. So let's kind of triangulate a little bit. And now black has taken opposition. So why doesn't this matter? Well, what happens in the previous version, right? The previous version, when I push the pawn, black can step in front, and I push it again, and what can they do? They can go straight back. They can stay in front of the pawn. In this case, if they try and do that, they're stepping off the board. So it's not legal. So they actually have to move out of the way. That's why it's okay in that very last row to do it, when you get your king to the 6th and the pawn to the 5th. But otherwise, right, if we do that one row earlier, so let's get back here. One row earlier, it doesn't work anymore. Because now, when I step the king out of the way and push the pawn, if they had to go here, white wins. But they can step back. And so it is a draw. And when they're on the last rank, they can't make that backward step. Okay, so that's really the kind of fundamental principles of this endgame. You need your king to get to a key square, and if you get to that theoretical position, king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, or 3rd and 4th if you're playing as black, then you know you can win, and it's all about understanding opposition and those waiting moves if you need to take it back, and again, those key squares. So keep those ideas in your head. We're going to talk about just a handful of complications, but truthfully, this is like the basics. If you understand these fundamentals, you can apply this to any position. It doesn't matter if the pawn is over here, or over here, or over here, right? We can always start to figure it out using these ideas. Okay, so let's quickly jump to this position. In this position here, it is white's turn to move. Can white win this game, or can black hold a draw? Take a look, try and figure out what you think, and let me know, and we'll discuss. Anyone have a guess? Do you think white can force a win, or do you think, and it's white to move, do you think black can hold a draw? Okay, you are not alone. A few people in the chat here as well. Let's think about this question. The way we're going to figure it out is key squares. So where are the key squares? If the pawn is on c3, right, it's the 3 in front, but up a row. So b5, c5, d5. Can we force our king onto any of those squares? Well, this is now a tricky question because it's not one move, right? We can't get our king onto those squares in one move. The question is, can we get our king onto any of those squares, period? Well, what are the ways we can try, right? We can try and move towards it. If we move away, we already know we're going to be behind the pawn, and black is going to be able to force a draw. So the only chance of doing this is to make some forward move. And the same thing, right? If we push the pawn, our opponent just steps in front, and we can't do it. So what we need to think about is opposition. We can also sort of think about forcing moves in a really weird way, because we're thinking about how we're forcing our opponent to move their king to stop us. So let's imagine I play, I think, what looks like the most natural move, king to c4, just stepping in front of the pawn. Well, does black have any move that's then going to keep me from getting onto the key squares? In this case, yes. Black can take opposition here. And we know, because I don't have a way to push the pawn, it's going to be a draw. So I can't go to c4, because then you take opposition and stop me. Well, I have indirect opposition. I can go king to b4. We're in a straight line indirectly. And now, what's really interesting is black has to stop us from getting onto b5. If they don't, right, if they play any move that lets us get onto b5, we're on a key square, and we know we're going to win. And the only move black can play to stop us from doing that is to go to c6. But now we can take opposition ourselves, king to c4. And black has to concede space. We outflank. And we've made it to a key square. So in this position, we actually can win, but we have to be very careful, right? That's the thing with some of these endgames, is one move is the difference between winning and losing, right? This is, I think, why endgames are often harder than any other phase of the game, because it's very rare. I mean, there are blunders, but it's very rare that just one single move is going to dramatically affect the course of the game in the same way that it does in an endgame. So keep an eye on indirect opposition. And again, I would think about this just as a matter of these forcing moves, right? I want to get onto one of these 3 squares. And so if I'm playing a move like this, well, you have to stop me. And then I can take opposition. Okay, so now that we've looked at that one, again, the idea king b4, take opposition. And wherever our opponent goes, they concede space. We keep forming the red carpet, and we're going to make our way down to the edge of the board. One more thing that can be a little tricky here. In this case, it is white to move. And this is a hard one. We're actually going to try and defend here, right? Because black has the pawn. It's white to move. The question is, do we have any move that holds a draw, or can black force a win? Let's see what we can figure out. Can we hold a draw as white, or can black force a win? And use the steps that we've been looking at before to try and identify that answer. Okay, so it looks like, looks like it's about half and half. Some people are saying a draw, some people are saying a win. So we're really unsure. Let's once again, I'm going to use the way I've been thinking about this. Let's think about the key squares. Maybe the first question is the king and pawn on the rows there need to be? No, the pawn's not on the 4th, the king's not on the 3rd, so it's not theoretically already a win. And then there's also this question of key squares. So right now, with the pawn on d5, the key squares for black are c3, d3, e3. If black can force their king onto any of those squares, black will win the game. So do we have any move that stops that? Well, this is where a really funny technique called distant opposition comes in. So we talked about opposition before as being the king's facing in a straight line. You can actually figure out opposition even if they're not in a straight line. I've done that, I think, in a previous lecture, so feel free to check that out. I think it's called opposition and outflanking. But for the purposes of this, let's just think about straight lines. We can still calculate who has opposition if the two are in a straight line. So we're going to come back to this example in a moment, but let's return to our idea of opposition here in general. Right? In this case, when white has opposition, what does that mean? That means the kings are facing each other in a straight line. There's one square in between, and it is your opponent's turn to move. Right? If you have taken opposition, your opponent has to move. We can actually generalize this even more, because it's not just one square, it's even or odd. If there are an even number of squares in between you and your opponent, and you're in a straight line, again, we can talk about those non-straight lines another day. But if you're in a straight line, if it's an odd amount of squares between you and your opponent, and it's your turn to move, then you don't have opposition. If it's an even amount of squares and it's your turn to move, you do. Because notice, when if it's white here, we have 2 squares in between, it's even, it's our turn to move, and when we move closer, we turn it into 1, which is odd. So you want to be the one moving towards your opponent when you have an even number of squares in between the 2 kings. And you want your opponent to have to move when there's an odd number, because if it's just 1, then it's obvious. If it's 3, it's maybe less clear, but we can still figure it out. In this case, I just moved back, so it's black's turn to move. They're moving with an odd number of squares. And notice, if they make any forward move, we take opposition. If they move backwards, we can move forwards and keep the same line and the same number of squares, so that doesn't change anything. And if they just move to the side, what do we do here? Well, we can move to the side. Because if we move forwards, now there's an even number, and we don't want them to move with the even number in between. So I can move to the side and maintain opposition. So that's the idea of distant opposition. Why is this relevant, right? Because in this case, it doesn't matter, right? We know we're on a key square, we're going to promote. Here's where it does matter. In this case, we can take distant opposition, which means we are going to keep it when they move closer. If we move our king to c2, the natural move here, we lose. Because after king to c2, there is an odd number of squares there's an even number of squares between the two kings, and it's our opponent's turn to move. They're going to move and take opposition. The pawn is promoting. So what do we do instead? If we move, some suggested like b2. B2 doesn't work because they can also still take opposition. They can also just take indirect opposition and then cut straight to a key square. But if we play king to c1 here, there's an odd number of squares in between the kings, and whoever moves forward, in this case our opponent has to, we're going to move our king to meet them with opposition. So in this case, right, if you push the pawn, the king's behind the pawn. But if you move the king anywhere, I take opposition. And you have not yet made it to the third rank. You are one row or one rank too far behind with both the king and the pawn. If it was one more forward, then you would win. But in this case, you're not far enough forward. So that is a confusing concept. Sometimes if you need to, after this video, go back and rewatch that section or think about it a little more, that's okay. Distant opposition is tricky, but it's really important because it can be the difference in this case between winning and losing a game like this. Question?
Yeah. After king c1, what are we supposed to do to take like king d6?
Oh yeah, so king d6. Anytime they go behind the pawn, right, all we have to do is get our king in front, right? Because here the key squares haven't moved. The key squares are still c3, d3, and e3. So as long as we can stop their king from getting to one of those squares, we're fine. In this case, we can just actually step in front of the pawn. So anytime they let us step in front, something like this, we know that our king is in front of the pawn and they can't get far enough forward. So this is always going to be a draw because of what we looked at in the beginning, right? They can't ever move their king forward. We can step. So if they push the pawn, if we keep our king in front and take opposition when possible, we're eventually going to get to this same endgame. And here's the critical move, right? You want to stay in front of the pawn here because when they step out of the way, we need to meet them with opposition. If they meet us with opposition, then they're going to push without it being check, and we have to step out of the way. So we go straight back, stay in front of the pawn, and prepare to meet black with opposition wherever they go. When they push the pawn, right, they can try and delay, but we always just go right back in front of the pawn and prepare to meet them with opposition. And inevitably when they push, we step in front, because if you push the pawn with check, it's going to be a draw. Black now either forces a stalemate or they step far enough away that I can just take the pawn. So good question. Okay. Final thoughts here. Again, I know there's a lot of just principles have been thrown at you. I encourage you to practice this. This is one of the really nice things with a website like Lichess or any other just database or software, that you can just set up a position very quickly, right? Here I can go to a board editor, and you can do that yourself as well, and set up a position with just two kings and a pawn and practice this. You can play against a friend, you can play against the computer, and if you win when you're, or sorry, if you lose when you're not supposed to or draw when you're not supposed to, you can go back and figure out, what did I do wrong? How could I have gotten to a key square, and try and figure that out. Okay, a few final clarifications. First, all this is different when it's a rook pawn. So everything I've said applies if the pawn is on any of these files, B through G. But if it is on an edge of the board, the math changes. Basically, I don't have the perfect rule, but the closest I can get for you is if your opponent's king can step into the corner where the pawn is meant to promote, then it is a draw. So and I'll show this, right? So let's say in this case, I can take opposition, but it doesn't actually matter. We can actually, it's kind of funny. We can see it right in this position, right? I can take opposition, and what's the goal with opposition? Well, I want to force you out of the way so I can move forward, but I can't step off the board. Okay, so I can't make forward progress with the king. That's unfortunate. But even if you let me, right? Even if you let me get all the way as far close as I want, I still run into a problem. As long as you stay in the corner, and basically if you're defending here, you just want to play king to the corner where the pawn is trying to go, and then move either towards the pawn or one to the side, and then back. And you just want to do that for the whole game. And the problem will be that this will always force a draw. If I push with check, then it's the same problem as before. It's just this board part is gone. It's either a stalemate or you take the pawn. But even if I push without check, so again, let me kind of triangulate a little bit here. If I push without check, it's still a stalemate. Because in this case, the move I was hoping you would play is king diagonally off, like this way, but on the other side, which is again off the board. So because you don't have enough space to step out of the way of the pawn, it's going to be a stalemate every time if the king is able to get to the corner. So that's kind of the first consideration. There is one additional one, which, yeah, we got enough time. I'm going to quickly flip over here. You can actually force this to be a draw even if you can't get your king to the corner, right? In this case, let's say it's white to move. Even though black's king is both in front of the pawn and stopping me from getting to the corner. You can, the key squares don't really apply to the rook pawn, so don't think about those. You can also keep the king, because there is no space off the board, we can use that to our advantage here. And as long as we keep the king trapped on the edge, the pawn can never promote, right? Because the pawn can't push it through the king. So here I would play the move king to f2, taking once again opposition, stopping the king from making progress, and I'm basically again controlling the space I want to lock you out of. And black is stuck, right? If you push the pawn, then I can play king to f1, and you have a really nasty choice. You can either play king to g3, and I will zip over to the corner, and we already saw why this is a draw. So you can also try instead to stay in front of the pawn, but now you are slowly going to be suffocated, because if you keep bouncing back and forth, it's repetition. Eventually you push the pawn, and I can play king to f1, taking opposition, and here it's a stalemate. But it's funny because normally the stalemates are, we're committing them when we have the extra pawn. Here, black has the extra pawn, it's just stuck, and the king is stuck because our king has opposition. So if you can lock if you're down the pawn and you can lock your opponent's king onto the wall, you can also get a draw in that way. So keep that in mind too. Rook pawns are notoriously problematic. One kind of middle game tip for you is if you have the option to trade some pawns and you can force your opponent to keep a rook pawn and you can get a center pawn or a flank pawn, often it will be better for you in an endgame. So that's a nice thing to keep in mind. Okay, so those are kind of the two complications with the rook pawns. But again, anytime it's not a rook pawn, it's very, very simple to, not always simple, but we can always understand the principles at play in figuring out who's going to win or not, right? Any given position, all we have to do is ask ourselves, well, first, if it's already on like the 6th and 5th, if it's far enough down the board, you don't have to think about moves. Just you say, is this the known position I know? Is the king on the 6th, the pawn on the 5th, and the opponent's king on the final rank? Or again, 3rd, 4th, and 1st if you're playing as black. If that's the case, do I have opposition? If so, I take it and outflank, control the squares. Right, here it's probably better if I actually display this yet again. Right, if I have opposition, then I take it, outflank to control the red carpet and push the pawn down the board. If I don't have opposition, that's not what I want to do. If my opponent has opposition, then I want to simply step out of the way, and the timing works that I can push the pawn without calling check. Once again, control the promotion square. Farther back, all the question is can I control the key squares? So with something like this, oops, this one, I figure out where the key squares are. It's the 3 squares right in front of the pawn, but up a row, because we want that one row of breathing room in case we need to waste a move when our opponent takes opposition. So if I can get to one of these key squares, I know that I can win. If my opponent can stop me from getting to any of them, then my opponent can hold a draw. In this case, I know that I will have time to make it. And once I do, it's simply a matter of outflanking and knowing when it's safe to push the pawn, right? In this case, some people might still make the mistake of playing pawn to c4. Well, when the pawn is on c4, the key squares are these 3, and my opponent can take opposition. There is no space between me and the pawn, and this would be a draw. I could play this one because I'm on this key square. That's always safe. And the one kind of final position I'll look at with you is, I'm actually going to put it back here. We'll talk about one thing that's not exactly the key squares idea. Let's do this. So if you get to a position like this, right, where again your opponent is kind of chasing after you, you really have to know what to do, but it's very simple. We say, if I get too far away, I want to control the space in front, but if I let the king step in, I'm going to lose the pawn. So I want to push the pawn, and I just have to ask myself before I do, can I get my king to a key square? In this case, yes, you can't stop me from getting to b6, so I will push, and I will move forward and say something like this. You can also get into some confusions here. You could try and maybe repeat and get confused, but notice we actually have a few ways to win this. One, we can just push the pawn and then realize we can take opposition. We can also say, even if I don't have opposition, my king is on the 6th. So if I get my pawn to the 5th, even if my opponent somehow managed to take opposition, I'm still on the right ranks. So I can still step out of the way, and the timing works out because in this case, my opponent cannot move their king backwards. They have to step forwards. Okay, hopefully that has been helpful for you. The final things we're going to look at is just kind of a little addendum I want to add in here that also has to do with one king and one pawn promoting, so it seems important. A lot of you might already know this, but this is the rule of the square. If your king is just hopelessly far away from your pawn, often this will happen in endgames where there is some simplification. So we trade some of our pieces and one side keeps a pawn and it's like, okay, well now it's a race situation. I don't know if I'm going to promote or if my opponent's going to get to me. There's an easy way to figure out who is going to win this race, right? In this case, let's say it's white's turn to move. What you want to do is you want to figure out when it's the king's turn to move, will the king be able to step into an imaginary square? And here's what I do. I say, where will the pawn be? And then I draw a diagonal line. I mean, you can also just in your head draw it to see where the square it promotes, a diagonal line to the edge of the board, right? Kind of pretend it's a bishop. Where would it land if it hit the edge of the board? And then you connect those coordinates. So in this case, it would be, if I really was bad at visualization, I could say, okay, the pawn diagonally would be on e8. Here it would be on b8. Here it's on b5. And then b and e would be, e8 and b5 would have the child of e5. So this would be that square, if it were black's turn to move. So if it's black's turn to move, black can stop the pawn, because the question is, can black step into this square? If it's white's turn to move, then the pawn is going to be on b6 when it's black's turn to move. Our coordinates will be b6, b8, d8, and then we can kind of triangulate that to d6. Can black's king step into that square? No. So white's going to win this race. And here, let's quickly show that if it had been black's turn to move. So I'm going to move my king. In this case, now we see the square. Okay, it's the king's turn to move, so where is the pawn? It's here. This is our square, and the king can step in. Because the king is stepping onto an edge, we know that black is going to make it just in time, one move in time. We promote, and it gets captured. So it's a really quick way. Again, you're always fine to just calculate and count and think, okay, well, it's got 1, 2, 3, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4. You're always fine to do that. Sometimes I will kind of get confused in my head. So having this quick little rule I can just apply, and again, know without having to calculate anything, I think it's just a helpful little tool. Let me give another example here. In this case, it is black to move. The question is, can black stop the pawn from promoting, or will the pawn make it in the nick of time? What do we think? Is this a win for white because we promote safely, or is it a draw because black is going to catch the pawn? All right, somebody says he can walk into the square. Some people say black can catch. Some people say it's a draw, win. So we're really mixed. This one is really tricky. This one is very tricky. Why is it tricky? It's because when the pawn moves, it's going to move twice. So the way to catch that, the way to account for that, is when it's the pawn's first move and it's going to move twice. The question we asked before was, where is the pawn when the king moves towards it? Right here, the king is moving, so we ask where's the pawn. But because it can move two, I just cut up a square. So I say, let's imagine the pawn is here. Because its next move, it's going to go here, whether it moves one or two. So on h3, we go to the edge of the board. The king cannot step into this box. The king is going to be one move too slow. Let's test it out. It's looking close. The king is one move too slow. Again, in my opinion, way easier to figure out that quick square than to try and count, okay, you go here, you go here, you go here. I'm way more likely to lose track of it. So that is my advice for figuring out these positions. The way we can apply this, because again, a lot of times people are like, how does this apply to my real chess games? I'm never going to get a position like this. Well, you might get a position like this. This seems realistic. In this position, it's white's turn to move. The question is, should we trade queens? Because black is up material. So normally when you're down material, you don't want to trade. But we notice, even though black has 3 uncontested passed pawns on this side, we have 2 that are very close to promotion and only 1 in the way. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, after we make all these trades, is the black king going to be in the square? You can now apply this to a middle game position. I mean, this is still an endgame, but we can apply it in a more complex position. In my mind, I would think of it like this. And you can obviously pause the video or take a thought here if you think we should be able to win. But the answer here is yes. And here's how we figure it out. We trade the queens, black is forced onto f6. If we don't trade the queens, we might still be able to win, but we also have to deal with them having a queen and some extra pawns, and maybe we just lose. So we can calculate, I'm going to force this queen trade, and the king ends up here. I push the pawn. It is the king's turn to move with the pawn on b6. Here is the box, or the square. The king cannot make it into that square. But it's complicated, because you can take the pawn. But if you take it, I take back, and nothing has actually changed. I still have a pawn that's in this box. So I know if I make this trade, the king is 1 move too slow, and white is actually winning this game. This is how we can apply some of these rules, right? You could do a similar one. I don't think I attached it in this example, but a similar study you could consider, like we could get rid of all of these pieces and just say it's like a 2v1 or a 3v4 and figure out, when we make these pawn trades, is my king going to be able to get to a key square, or can my opponent stop me, right? We can apply all these same principles, these theoretical endgames, because the goal is, chess is all about calculation. The whole game is one big calculation battle. And there's some differences, right? Some openings, there's memorization, and there's principles, and there's kind of theory, but anything we can do to help us reduce how much we have to calculate is really helpful. So in my mind, I would rather be able to look at a position like this and say, I only need to calculate queen takes queen, king takes, pawn to b6. That's all I need to think about to know if I'm winning or if it's a draw or if black's winning. Because if I can get that far, that's way easier than me calculating all the way down. So these steps hopefully can help you reduce the amount of things you need to calculate and focus on the stuff like this, where it's more complex. How can you simplify? How can you use your forcing moves? And how can you find the right moves in your games? So that is all the time we have for tonight. I hope this has been helpful for you in navigating some of these really tricky king and pawn endgames. And I hope to do a little more on this in the future, with maybe adding some extra pawns in. And again, how do we deal with this complexity and navigate it? All right, I hope to see you again in the future, and please stick around because our Grandmaster Danish Boros will be streaming right after this, Grandmaster's Choice. Until next time.